Welcome to Walls of Sound. Your hosts, Brian Teasley and Ryan Murphy, have spent decades on both sides of the stage, from playing in bands and running venues to uncovering the stories and history behind those spaces. This is the podcast where music meets the places that shape it. And here, they'll explore the people, history, and culture of music venues, how they're built, how they're run, and how they've created the soundtracks of our lives. From legendary halls to underground hideaways, these walls hold the stories that make music come alive. So step inside, because every wall has a story to tell.
Welcome to another episode of Walls of Sound. I'm Brian Teasley along with Ryan Murphy. We're here today with Jesse Rifkin, who's a writer, musician, historian, and he's the proprietor of a very cool thing called the Walk on the Wild Side Tours NYC, which is this series of immersive walking tours that trace back through the history of New York's music scenes and communities, through the neighborhoods, the venues, the spaces, all sorts of places where it all happened. He's also the author of a really remarkable book that we'll be discussing today called This Must Be the Place: Music, Community, and Vanished Spaces in New York City. I often think the word erudite is pretentious when people use it, but this book is really deserving of that description. It's dense and it's a fascinating work that really goes deep into the soul of New York City's music history. Ryan, what did you think?
It's pretty incredible. So I just got the book to send to my dad. You know, when he was like 14, he was running away from home, living in New Jersey, going to New York to the Gaslight. And he has all these stories. So to start the book off, immediately was, I can't wait for my dad to read this. Because this is like, hey, do I get to call bullshit on my dad for all these stories? But there was stories in there that were the way my dad described certain aspects of the scene, or how even like Richie Havens or Bob Dylan, or some of the things, how it was welcomed and perceived. It was just really cool. So I appreciate the fact that you did such a span of time. Like, it's pretty daunting.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Jesse, did you start the book during the pandemic? Is that where the idea was kind of birthed out of?
Sort of. I met with the guy that ended up being my editor October, November of 2019. He reached out to me. He found me on Instagram and knew about my tours and stuff. And he was like, hey, have you ever thought about turning this into a book? Which I had not. You know, sort of this opportunity presenting itself that I was just like, I'm not going to pass this up. But then when the pandemic hit and I couldn't work, I finally had all this time to write the book proposal, which got, greenlit almost immediately. And the timing ended up being really ideal for me. Obviously, there were larger downsides to the pandemic, but for me writing this book, a lot of people that I wanted to talk to were stuck at home with nothing to do, musicians that would otherwise be on tour. So I think I got access to a lot of people that I probably would not have had access to otherwise.
So that worked in your favor in a very strange way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Did you feel like you came at the subject matter with a lot of knowledge from doing the Walk on the Wild Side tours already?
I thought I did. I thought I was already like kind of an expert in this stuff, but it turned out there was so much that I didn't know, or not that I had a lot of stuff wrong necessarily, but just my information was really spotty. That was not really my fault, because a lot of this stuff had never been written about or talked about publicly. The sort of minutia of music venues and neighborhoods and how they operate. A lot of the writing about music in New York, especially your more popular, punk era or the folk era or whatnot, tends to kind of focus on these legendary figures, or like Bob Dylan or Patti Smith or whatever.
I guess first I should back up for a second. You toured a decent bit on your own in the mid-aughts era. Is that kind of the time period?
Yeah. I guess I started touring in like 2003, 2004. Most of the touring that I did was at the like absolute lowest rung of touring that you can do. A lot of house shows and pizzerias, and which, I mean, I've loved. I'm not complaining in any way. One of the really great things about that, my quote unquote music career never took off. But the great thing about that is that I was never so wrapped up in what I was doing that I couldn't kind of take a step back and observe what was going on around me. And getting to tour at that particular, that lower rung, you really see the local communities everywhere you go. You see the similarities and the differences and what allows them to thrive or not thrive. And I think that really is kind of the backdrop to the work I do now. That I really got to understand the nuts and bolts of music scenes just from doing that for as long as I did at the level that I was doing it.
Yeah, it's, I was thinking about it earlier because someone had posted a picture and I was thinking the other day about, do you remember that Maximum Rock and Roll did that book, Your Own Fucking Life? And I remember, I was in high school in Daytona Beach, Florida, and I had put my parents' landline number in it and hey, just call. And, it's so true. I always my touring also, I'm so grateful that you put it perfectly well, but just to be able to hey, we're playing this house show or a pizza place or wherever. And it's you get to a town, you immediately get to meet the people that you want to meet in that town. And they're showing you their town. You're going to probably stay at their house as well. Crazy to look back on that night. I was looking through, someone had found one of those old Book Your Own Fucking Life. It's crazy that this is what we did to tour, but how cool was it? Now there's communication. It's so much easier, but somehow that's disconnected. Anyways, I was reflecting on that because I was telling Brian, it's interesting too to see how my band played in New York. The first shows were at ABC No Rio, and that's when we were the purest. And I remember there was even mention of, hey, maybe next time the Knitting Factory or something. I said, we're no sellouts. We're playing ABC No Rio. And, and then the next time around, a little more mature, we got to play at the Bowery Ballroom, and that was pretty awesome. But then recently, when I tried to go back on tour, I was telling Brian, we played the basement of a seafood restaurant, and a fried clam place in Brooklyn or something. I loved it because I'm just hanging out in Brooklyn. Oh yeah, I got to play a show tonight at the seafood restaurant.
Right.
It's amazing how many spaces there are covered in your book that, some were proper clubs, some, there's a whole chapter on the Ornette Coleman era Ford loft jazz scene where people just kind of took everything in their own hands, which had its own politics and its own complexities. But just to clarify, the main focus is just on Lower Manhattan, and it's 500 pages dense. And then the last chapter, obviously, because it's one stop away, is Brooklyn. I guess it would have been impossible to cover the whole stretch.
When I first turned the book in, I turned it in chapter by chapter. And at the end of that, my editor called me and he was like, hey, do you know how long your book is? I was like, no, I have no idea. It's 1,500 pages.
Wow.
It's I don't have the time to read this. We have to cut most of it. So that's really when the decision was made to limit it to quote unquote downtown, which for the most part means Lower Manhattan. But because downtown is as much a vibe or a mindset as it is a physical location, downtown, it extends to Midtown in the 80s, clubs like Danceteria. And then in the 90s, it starts to move to Brooklyn. The book kind of had to naturally go there because that's where the scene went when it couldn't survive in Manhattan anymore. Yeah. And that was the era I was around for and participating in. So I really wanted to have that in the book.
One thing that you start with the book that's kind of one of the heavy premises is people think that once a scene has moved or migrated to somewhere else, that it's never going to happen. There never is going to be a DIY scene in Soho again or something like that. Right. And your point is when you were researching a lot of this, some of these neighborhoods were really fancy to begin with and upscale, and then became urban blight in the 70s, which caused artists to go there. Who's to say they're not going to turn back to that at some point?
Absolutely. That was one of the really mind-blowing things I learned in doing research for the book was that Soho, which is now, Chanel and Louis Vuitton stores, when it was first built, it was a high-end shopping district. And so in a way, it's not really gentrified. It's just gone back to its intended purpose after this kind of long detour. It's back to what it was originally meant to be. There was a Tiffany store there in the 1800s, and it's there again. But yeah, I think especially kind of being in the city through the pandemic, seeing it then, seeing it now, it's a very, very different place than it was beforehand, and I think very tangibly in a transitional stage. And what it's transitioning to is sort of unclear, but the work from home stuff, there's a lot of like multi-year office leases that are about to come up for renewal that are not going to be renewed. And there's going to be a lot of space, especially in Midtown and in the financial district. There already is a lot of space. And all the like businesses that serve commuters are struggling or are closing. There's a lot of empty storefronts. It's, I think, not unreasonable to assume that, some of these office buildings, like they're not up to code. You can't legally have people, you can't turn them into apartment buildings. Much like the factories that were in Soho where these artists start kind of squatting and living. But that doesn't, just because they're not up to code doesn't mean you can't have people living there and doing cool shit there illegally. It seems pretty likely to me, or at least possible to me, that we could be seeing that in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
Can DIY venues still exist in Manhattan or Brooklyn like Death by Audio was, or Glasslands, or some of these? Do you think that's still possible?
Absolutely. I know that they exist. I've been to them. They have to operate a little differently than they used to because I think a lot of hard lessons were learned in the 2000s. The hardest...
A ghost ship fire in Oakland changed everything.
Yeah, that absolutely was transformative. And again, talking about, having potential DIY venues in Midtown office buildings, they're already very well equipped with fire exits. So that is potential positive. But, I think one of the really hard lessons the scene had to learn is that if you promote your venues and your shows on social media, every landlord is combing through it. Every real estate agent is combing through it. They know exactly, the NYPD is coming through it. Everybody knows exactly what's happening, where it's happening, how many people are going. And that creates this indicator of like, should we raise the rent? Is this neighborhood about to be like, is it going to blow up? And, a lot of venues got shuttered because they were above ground enough in that way to get police attention, but they were still underground enough to not be legal. So the stuff I know about now that's happening on that kind of DIY, which is to say, unlicensed illegal level, has to be really cagey about promotion. We're kind of back to your whole like ask a punk, and it's you can't post stuff, you can't geotag photos online. Like it's just much more, has to be a little exclusive in that way to survive.
Are you saying that, like, besides the fear of things getting damaged or landlords being upset, people are doing something that's not authorized in their building or whatever? Are you saying that also, like, real estate agents kind of feel like it's almost a barometer if the neighborhood's going to start being really happening and hip?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow.
That's absolutely what I'm saying. Because if you have a neighborhood that is like, let's use Bushwick as an example, which is now just this like, it's almost like a university campus, nightlife and young people wall to wall. But Bushwick in the mid-aughts, or even earlier than that, it was just this like mostly Black and Latino neighborhood, very much a lower income neighborhood. And then you start getting these venues, these DIY venues in these neighborhoods that are having punk shows and, indie folk and whatever else. What that says is that young white people are going to this neighborhood. If there's stuff that's magnetic there that's going to draw them to the neighborhood to go to this show, some of them are going to start living there. Some of them probably already are living there. If that's the case, then we should start trying to advertise this. We, being the realtors, should start trying to advertise this neighborhood to upwardly mobile white people because there's potential,
That's so wild.
Yeah. And the other thing too with that is that, if they see that, this storefront is a DIY venue that's got some traction, then the rent will probably go up because they'll be like, oh, you guys have, X number of people coming here every night. Like I saw on Facebook, 300 people said yes to this event. So I know you guys are making money, so you got to pay.
It's crazy because I think about that. I've heard you mention that, and it's I think there was an interview you did with that author that had talked about the MySpace book that he had written.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael
And
Tedder.
I'm always fascinated about the like economy around music. And we talk about it a lot because of the projects we do and talking to the city and the support we need. And hey, there's a whole economy around music, this creative class, and we need to talk about all these things. It's never dawned on me that especially something that wants to be so underground and wants to be this subculture is being watched as an indicator to wedge this
Yeah.
economic driver even further.
No, I mean, there are a number of venues, like Glasslands in Brooklyn started out as an illegal venue. It was for, I think, the first entire year as they were slowly working on making enough money to acquire a liquor license. And eventually it becomes this fully licensed legal venue, which shared, just as sort of a funny wrinkle, shared a building with two other very much illegal venues. It's kind of sandwiched between them. So people always thought it was this illegal thing, even though Glasslands was like fully 100% above board. Yeah, it's expensive to do that, and it's hard to do that. And zoning often prevents you from doing it. The zoning in New York City is so labyrinthine that, it's just all kinds of things you can't do for kind of no reason in all kinds of places. Because clubs in New York need to turn such a high profit to survive at any level, the DIY model, I think, becomes that much more attractive. And, that's even true in the 70s when the city is as cheap as it's ever going to be. The jazz clubs, you were talking about the loft jazz stuff. The jazz clubs needed to turn enough of a profit that someone like Sun Ra couldn't get booked. There needed to be these DIY venues. Ornette Coleman had a venue in his house. Rashid Ali had a venue in his house. All these kinds of places, because like that was the only way you could present music that was uncommercial.
Do you think Williamsburg now is kind of at the tail end of maybe say how Manhattan became in 2007 and it's going to switch to another neighborhood or even further out or
Oh, it has. It already has. Williamsburg is just, that goose is totally cooked. And it happened so quickly. That was the thing, as I was saying before, the era that I kind of got to see up close, not from the very beginnings, but when I first came to Williamsburg, it was still very much anybody that you'd see on the street was probably doing something really cool and probably worth knowing. And now, like, Williamsburg is just tourists, and there's a Whole Foods and a Mac
Yeah.
store, but yeah, Williamsburg, it was able to be that because it was an industrial area. So there, in a lot of, at least along the waterfront and whatnot, there weren't people that took time to evict.
I remember when it seemed like the only band living in Brooklyn was They Might Be Giants. And then it was like, I remember maybe it was 98, maybe a hair earlier when like the guys in Wasabi Five and a bunch of, it's just like everybody was moving there. It was really wild and fresh and new.
There was a coffee shop famously on Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg called Verb Cafe that was, it seemed like it was staffed by like half of TV on the radio. And like a couple of the guys from Grizzly Bear and just like everybody that worked there was in some sort of band, was,
Right.
Of course.
Yeah.
So where are things headed now? Where people are doing really
Neighborhood wise?
inventive, underground kind of stuff. Yeah. Or should we not say?
Well, no, I would say Ridgewood, Queens is where things are happening now. They are, and only because if you follow the L train, which goes from Manhattan to Williamsburg to Bushwick, where things were happening for a long time, and then Ridgewood. Yeah. So it's just been following the train line. But Ridgewood, I think, is already kind of at like, I don't think it's going to get even cooler. I think people know about it enough now, and there's so much happening there now that like we might be sort of at the beginning of the part where it gets oversaturated and crappy.
Is your passion, is it more just New York City, or could you ever see yourself doing a book on LA music venues or London music venues? Or
Yeah,
I've definitely thought about doing London because London's a very similar city. To some degree, you could almost reduce all of like pop culture history or pop music history, at least, to just New York and London. The real through line between those two cities is that they are incredibly multicultural and they are very pedestrian oriented, or there's excellent public transportation. So you live the parts of your life that you would live in a car anywhere else, you live publicly. So you're exposed to people and to ideas and sounds and things without even trying to be. And that's, kind of how you get these interesting fusions and new ideas. LA is such a car-oriented city.
Sure.
And I think it's sort of notable that like you have a lot of music, incredible music coming out of LA. I would never deny that. But you don't have a lot of genres being born. Stuff seems to go to LA to be like perfected and honed,
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, like stuff gets born in New York City so often. I think for the reason I was saying, or in London, because just people are constantly being forced into close quarters.
One thing I was thinking about, I don't know if you've seen this, Jesse, but it's just like I reflect on like how I still think about how there's people monitoring, certain trends and looking at like the trying to follow this to like kind of follow where the next hip neighborhood is. Do you think there's people out there who are helping facilitate, kind of help push towards certain areas to watch it thrive and then ultimately kind of just strip it of that and build a high rise or whatever? And I think I say that in a way of, I think about whether it be in Nashville or there's certain places where it's like, oh, wow, they're really helping this music scene be built around here. And you're watching some of these people help facilitate it as they build the infrastructure around. And as soon as that's set and they fill those apartments, they go, guess what? You're out, kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh,
I mean,
unquestionably. I mean, that's what happened in Williamsburg. The real estate industry and builders and whatnot were very, very aware because the pattern had happened over and over. Enough at that point that like if you want to turn an area around, art and music will do it. They're very deliberately renting space to artists and musicians and venues, and because they know it's going to make the property value go up.
But then it's time to get rid of that creative class once, you have that in place. And I think about it, the places that I'm like, the same people that helped facilitate it have turned around and are really helping impose noise ordinances, sound curfew, the things that were like, wait a minute, this wasn't part of the beginning of this whole conversation. And there's people moving in that knew why they were moving in, but yet that's all of a sudden a problem. It's crazy.
Yeah. Sometimes they're very upfront about it. Like one of the venues that I wrote about, a place called Monster Island, which was really kind of a complex with a few venues in it. But Monster Island, when they got this building on the Williamsburg waterfront, it was made very clear to them from the outset that like this was going to exist for 7 years. It was never going to exist for longer than that. When the time came, the venues had to leave and the building was demolished and now it's a Trader Joe's. And like... But that was the plan from the outset, and everybody knew it.
I guess maybe not as nefarious as obvious in so many places, unfortunately, yeah.
Backing up just for a second, I know in some sense it's kind of stock to talk about it, and I think you pointed out in your book, in some ways, CBGB is kind of the most overexplored club of all time. But at the same time, when you try to really pin it down, what made, and I you can kind of throw Max's and the Mud Club in there, similar eras. It's hard to exactly put a finger on what made that scene have those caliber of bands, but something kind of occurred to me in your book that I had talked to Will from Echo and the Bunnymen about Eric's in Liverpool, and he was talking about how he saw Joy Division when they were still Warsaw.
Yeah.
And it was horrible. And then like 6 weeks later, they came back as Joy Division and they were mind blowing. Part of it seems also of having a club where bands gestate like that and get to play often and still have an audience. That doesn't really seem to exist anymore because these bands, and I forget who was talking about it, but you interviewed somebody that said that's kind of what happened to Blondie.
Legs McNeil. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. So that's really changed over the years, hasn't it?
I mean, CBGB is so unique in that way. Like, I really don't think you could say the same of the Mud Club, for example, because the Mud Club was really mostly booking known quantities. But CBGB, when it opened on the worst, most crime-ridden street in all of Manhattan, which puts it high in the running for like the worst street in the world, in this like incredibly desolate, economically distressed area that was also just by sheer coincidence at roughly the intersection of probably 5 different neighborhoods that gentrified in succession. So up until around the time it closes, it's still accessible to at least one area where artists are living on peanuts, which is it kind of accounts for its longevity, I think. Because it was in such a terrible area and the expectations were so low, it's sort of almost paradoxical that one of the things that really makes CBGB become this haven for incredible music is that there's like no curation. If they see even the slightest germ of an idea, even a bad idea, but just like an idea, you could play there. All of these artists and musicians are living in this neighborhood because it's so cheap. And this is just their like local. They would play there, no one else would book them. And they could play there like every week until they got good. And it's, Legs McNeil said that about Blondie, but it was also true of the Ramones. It was true of Talking Heads. When Talking Heads showed up on the scene, the Ramones used to love to have them open because they thought Talking Heads were the worst band in the community. And that made the Ramones look good.
Smart.
Yeah.
The thing that occurs to me, and someone that's built and designed a few clubs, like you try to create such an amazing experience for artists and for patrons. But at the same time, the one thing that you can't exactly steer is the music scene around it.
Yeah.
Sometimes that just happens. I still think anything really, even though we were talking about how real estate brokers and people are jumping on these trends, I still think anything really hip or cool or whatever term you want to call it, it still has to stay unpredictable for it to really stick.
And, part of the way that changes, because you do see places like that, I think fewer and fewer of them. I think of the band Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah became this major phenomenon in New York entirely on the strength of a residency they had at this club called Pianos. Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah, they're playing there regularly. They don't have management. They don't have a record label. They don't have a publicist. But they start to get blog coverage very quickly, and these shows sell out, and then their like self-released CDR gets best new music on Pitchfork, and that's then they're like on their way. And you really saw a shift in New York in venues after that, where suddenly there's this expectation that a band can have hype and can have an audience and all of that from the outset. If you don't, it's like, well, why don't you? Or like around the same time, that band Beirut, I was at their first show, as it just so happened, which was at the Knitting Factory, and it was packed because they'd put like a couple songs on MySpace that became these massive internet phenomenons. So then there is this enormous audience, and there's a band that's not ready for it. The internet, I think, really changed everything.
And it's interesting, going back to your point about how it's becoming more how it was, which was like, it has to get a little more cloak and dagger with it. You have to like kind of earn it a little bit more, for lack of a better term, where it's just, that is kind of cool. Because it's crazy. Once I realized through booking and running venues that I'm like, I don't know who this is. And it doesn't matter. They post one thing on TikTok and it will sell out. Don't worry. I was like, this is insane. Like, this is just like, I feel old saying that, but it gives me hope that there's like, no matter what the genre or the scene, that, we got to keep this as underground and as like, hey, you need to know about this to like be there kind of thing. That kind of like it fills my heart with hope.
Yeah.
I think, it was funny. Jason, our engineer, I was talking to him about this earlier, and we've talked about it before. It's so easy to kind of be rock and roll boomer. We had kind of been talking about what was so interesting about the 90s was it seemed like there was a more defined line between what was mainstream and what was underground. And when you had a band like Fugazi, you had somebody that had a very clear stance on how they were going to conduct their band and how they were going to conduct their ethics. But at the same time, they had a pretty big megaphone where they were drawing 1,500 people in every city.
Right. I mean, the kind of crazy thing, though, with that, and I say this as a diehard Fugazi fan who grew up near DC and would go to see them always. is that Fugazi, the 90s is this era, especially when people in the indie world are like so obsessed with this concept of selling out. There's this like post-Nirvana feeding frenzy where everybody signs to a major label, and there's that whole Steve Albini essay,
Yeah,
some of your
sure.
friends are already this fucked. That was still a time when like you could pretty reasonably make a livable wage selling records and playing shows. So you could be maybe a little more principled about things.
Right. There was a middle class at that point, I think.
Exactly. Selling out is like an almost meaningless concept now. Like
Totally.
if you are going to take that kind of hard stance, who's paying your rent,
And in New York, that gets to be a much tougher proposition.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's hard to hold that against a band at this point.
Sure, of course. You break the book down, and some chapters kind of overlap with the scenes, but I'm trying to, by memory, although I have the book right here, I could just open it up. You break it down into kind of different groupings of eras and scenes and clubs. You start with the folk scene kind of revival of the 60s with Cafe Wad, Gertie's Music Folk City, and a lot of those places. And then it moves to the Loft Jazz and all those DIY spaces. And then you get into the 70s with CBGB and a lot of these clubs and where hip hop came in. And it goes on all the way up through No Wave and Brooklyn and like American hardcore era kind of stuff. Was there one chapter that really fascinated you that you dug in the most that you might not have known as much about before you really dove into the research?
I would say that there were like aspects of a few chapters that really fascinated me. With every chapter, it started because I had some base of knowledge of what these stories were, but the really kind of wild story for me is there's this chapter that's about kind of the early 80s with no wave and post-punk and kind of mutant disco and hip hop arriving downtown, all of these different things happening simultaneously. And the Mud Club gets a ton of credit for that. That's really like the famous club of that era. But as I started talking to people who were performers in that era, when I asked them, if there was a venue they thought of as their home base, they all would start talking so lovingly about this club Tier 3 that I had only ever heard about in like the most passing sense, even in books about no wave, or books about that era. Nobody would talk about Tier 3. And if you Googled it, there was one short interview online with the woman that ran it. And like, that was it. Just almost through just total serendipity, I found that woman. I connected with that woman on Instagram without even trying to. She agreed to an interview. Her name is Hillary Yeager. She agreed to an interview. She said it was only the second interview she'd done about Tier 3. Nobody had asked her to talk for a book. She donated some photos of Bush Tetras at Tier 3, one of which is on the cover of the book. Getting her cooperation and really learning the story of that place was extraordinary. It was really like a petri dish for this community. It was a place where musicians were actually going to hang out, as opposed to the Mud Club, which was always a little kind of starfuckery. Tier 3 was like, there isn't like a selective doorman, just anybody can come and hang out. And bands like Bush Tetras or Liquid or ESG or band after band that I could list, Sonic Youth, all kind of get to like take their first steps at Tier 3. To me, it's now like it's one of the probably most important clubs in New York history. And it only lasted for about a year and a half, but it's like an entire record collection's worth of bands played there.
I'd never even heard of Tier 3 before the book.
Me neither, yeah.
No, it was wild. And like getting to be the person who gets to like kind of tell that story at this wider level for the first time, I was very aware of that responsibility and that honor. My hope is that one of the things this book might do is like kind of help solidify that club's legacy and Hillary's legacy. She was also like one of the very few women booking bands. It's just this incredible place. So that out of everything, that was probably the most like mind-blowing and exciting.
That's
road.
super important history. Of that particular era, one thing that was really fascinating for me, a lot of people my age from the South were exposed to a film in the 80s called Athens, Georgia, Inside Out,
Oh
which
yeah.
it was kind of the first realization for me that, oh, you can just buy your clothes at a thrift store and move to some weird college town in the South and live in the house with your friends in a band and go to New York and become cool and famous. Because it's crazy how many bands were kind of embraced from Athens, if that was Pylon or B-52s or REM. And a friend of mine is doing a lot of research on this band called Limbo District, which was a really obscure Athens band. But it's the one like in that documentary that's kind of like the tier 3 of clubs. This band was to Athens, where everybody's like, oh, they were the best band in Athens. They were the weirdest band. It's crazy that no wave art scene embraced so many people from Athens, Georgia.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of criteria for that scene was like, how weird can you be? Athens, for whatever reason, there's clearly something in the water there.
Right.
That
right.
makes just the weirdest, coolest music come out of that place. Like, I've seen that documentary. It's an amazing, and that's even before like all the Elephant Six stuff. But I think a lot of those bands then get really embraced in New York by this community, especially at like Danceteria, which the booker at Danceteria was this woman, Ruth Polsky, who incredibly influential booker, but was really kind of enamored with out-of-town bands, booking a lot of stuff from the UK, and she was booking a lot of stuff from the South. There was almost this like novelty value to it.
Exotic.
Right, sure.
Yeah, it's like Americana, like what's, for people who had come up through the punk scene in the city, like punk was kind of turning into hardcore at that point, which is mostly teenagers and was kind of alienating to some of these people who are maybe getting closer to 30. So even though incredible stuff is happening in the city at that point, there's this consensus, at least among that community, that like it isn't really, kind of nothing's happening. And stuff from Athens especially becomes like, or stuff from LA, like Suburban Lawns and X and whatnot, becomes like this shibboleth in New York.
One part of the book that was just like epiphany dropping bomb on my head that I never really had even thought about it, and it makes a lot of sense, is that you point out very early on that a lot of times when people say what was the golden era of their scene or of New York City, they'll say what was happening in their 20s. Yep. And they'll say it became dead when they get in their mid-30s. And it's so true.
It's so true.
It's so true.
Yeah. People, that's not to say they don't have like awe and reverence for everything that came before, but they think that they lived through the last golden era. Like if you ask them when New York started to suck, it's like when they turned 35.
I was really proud of that moment where, because I remember people that used to be like, oh yeah, I saw the Buzzcocks or I saw the Stooges, MC5 or whatever. There's all these old record store owner guys that had that.
Right.
Then one day I started telling kids that work for me at the venue or whatever, it's like, oh, I saw Husker Du or I saw, like, what? No way.
You are that guy.
It took me like 20 years to become that guy, but I was so happy when I was so happy when it's like, oh yeah, I saw the Cramps back in the day or I saw Replacements. Yeah. We all become that guy if you stay around music long enough.
The old record store guy.
Yeah, it's funny. I had a moment recently where I was like, oh yeah, I saw Slater-Kinney when Janet Weiss was still in the band. And it like blew their mind.
Wow.
You know? Like this is this long bygone era. Crazy.
Janet's the best. She's the best.
Jesse, I was going to ask a bit about the tours because it fascinates me. What are the demographic? What is the audience that you see? And I say that by I'm fascinated by being in Northern Alabama where there's Muscle Shoals Sound Studio and Fame. And when I go, we work with them a lot. It's a lot of international. There's a lot of people from the UK and Germany, and they are so obsessed. It's like Mecca, and the knowledge they have is so deep. And I was just curious as the people you're getting to take on these tours.
Very much the same. It's probably 60 or 70% British people.
Wow.
And then a lot of Australians, and then a lot of Americans who are the one guy in this small Minnesota town who, knows who Liquid are. Just so desperate to talk to somebody else about this music that they like, The British thing. It blew my mind, and I've thought about it a lot. I think, the UK still has this very vibrant and passionate music press it's like mainstream, but the stuff that they cover is not at all. A magazine like Mojo or Q or whatever, there's as much interest in the past as there is in the present in these publications. So being super knowledgeable about like older obscure music, it's, I think, a lot more accessible and accepted in the UK. There also seems to be much less of a barrier between genres there, especially, if you think about like punk and disco in the United States. Punk gets really coded as straight and white, and disco gets really coded as gay and black, but that's not true in the UK. They're taking all of this stuff just in a vacuum. So the boundary between punk and disco or house music is like non-existent, which is how you get bands like New Order or Primal Scream or whatever. So yeah, I see people coming from the UK who just have a much more expansive tastes, and interests in that way.
I'm always blown away with the BBC having a documentary on like Flying Nun Records or Moondog. Or it's like, what? That's just on regular television?
Right.
Have you ever had anybody come on tour that's an uber nerd and you're like, well, this is where the stage at this venue used to sit? And they're like, actually, it used to be on the other side of the room, or...
I've had people try to outsmart me.
Yeah, you probably, your knowledge is pretty like
at this point. At this point, it's pretty hard to get me in that way. But I definitely have had people come who are super knowledgeable and super passionate. They've never met somebody before who knows more about this stuff than they do. Not to toot my own horn, but just it's my job.
Sure. Which they probably love. They're probably like, we bow to you, good sir.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
you are the more, adept holder of knowledge.
Yeah. Like it's funny, especially 3 or 4 times a month, I get somebody showing up to the tour. If I'm doing like the 70s punk tour, somebody who's like, you're too young to have been around for that. Like, why do you care? Like, why would I trust that you would know anything about this? My standard reply at this point has been like, well, I don't think the guy running the Alexander Hamilton tour was around for that. He's pretty good at it.
Well, what do you have on the horizon as far as like your next projects and next adventures in rock and roll?
There are some things in the works, a lot of which I can't say yet publicly, just because they're not totally solidified. I've been doing a lot of events around this book. A lot of like kind of in-person conversations with people who I interviewed for the book. I'm also running, the past several months, I have a Substack where I've been doing long-form interviews, both publishing long-form interviews that I did for the book, doing new interviews with people that I like probably should have talked to for the book. So that's been a really fun project to have. And, I'm incredibly lucky to have found this weird niche. I'm good at it, but also there's nobody else doing it.
Special thing.
Yeah. So, it's just trying to do as much as I can within that, with that base of knowledge and that much access to people and to information.
Before we wrap up here, Jesse, we should take a second to have you say where people can find you, both with the tour and your Substack and your Instagram, which is a really incredible Instagram feed of
Thank you.
A lot of old, rare New York photos of musicians and clubs and all sorts of a variety of things.
A lot of it is Walk on the Wild Side NYC. So my business's website is walkonthewildsidenyc.com. Substack is walkonthewildsidenyc.substack.com. Instagram is Walk on the Wild Side NYC. I have my little branding. Everything links to the main website. So you can find the Substack there. You can buy signed copies of the book there, find the Instagram there. Yeah, that's where I'm at. That's how you can find me.
We'll have to figure out some strange excuse to get you down into the heart of Alabama here.
Oh man, I would love that.
Well, this was, the book is incredible.
It really is.
It was,
thank you.
A history lesson for me. And so in somebody that thought they knew a bunch about the New York scene, especially in the 70s, I felt like I definitely got taken to school on it in a good way. And the book had so much clarity and ease to read. Even though it's 500 pages, it reads real quickly. And not only do we talk so much about the actual history and contents of it, but the writing style is really great as well. In rock and roll writing, I find you have to be somewhat conversational. You can't be too writerly.
Yeah.
And you find a great balance to have some writerly moments, but at the same time, speak the people's language, so to say.
Yeah.
And that's a really hard thing in rock journalism to do.
Thank you. I mean, it was really important to me, especially because I'm talking about so much minutia, to not come across as pedantic, academic-y. Like, really, it's a book about gentrification, but I was very conscious that I couldn't put that word in the title because people would
Right.
pick that up and be like, oh, this is a scolding academic thing.
Right.
I wrote it like I was leading a tour, like you're just having a conversation with somebody.
Awesome, Jesse. Thank you so much for your
Thank you, man.
time. It was a real pleasure to get to talk to you.
Yeah, man.
It was
Thank
great.
you.